Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So you and I used to work together at Fox News, and little did I know that someone else in that building also had endometriosis. And when I came forward publicly and wrote an essay about it, you reached out to show me your support and also disclose that you too had the disease. And for me, I just want to say thank you because I felt alone and did not have any friends with the disease. I didn't have anybody to really turn for support, and to know that someone was right there in the same location dealing with a similar journey really helped.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hard parts about struggling from this, because this is an invisible illness, right? We don't know how many women and how many people born with uteruses are struggling, and it's not something that people talk about a lot. So as soon as I saw, that you had that and what you were so brave to share, I felt like I had to. And I think that's kind of been a pattern in suffering with this, knowing that there are other people, even though people don't talk about it a lot, which I think is rooted in a lot of misogyny and the fact that like this seems to be a women's disease, although we know it's not. And I'm sure we'll talk further about that. But there's like a taboo stigma tied to talking about something that may be related to a gynecological condition.
Mm-hmm. And cut to now, you are an executive producer at MSNBC, and you have bravely shared your story on a national platform on NBC News with an op-ed talking about what you have gone through and encountered with endometriosis. Why did you decide now is the time for you?
I'm kind of a person who has always just lived this life mantra of I'll power through it. I'll deal with it. It's fine. I got this. And I think a lot of that I'm realizing kind of now as I'm looking back is rooted in almost fear that pretending like you can get through something or suffering through it would somehow be seen as a weakness. And I just kind of wanted to flip the script on the narrative and say, you know what? I don't need to power through this anymore. I don't want to power through this anymore. And I want people to know that this is no joke. Like the fact that we live our lives and work and have families and have friends and go and do things and work really hard, and we suffer with this horrifically debilitating disease. I don't want to suffer in silence, and I don't want to power through that. I want to be able to say, I have this, I'm getting in front of it, and I want to share my journey with others so that they know that they can do the same and they can feel empowered to say, it's not okay. And I think in the process, I also learned when people used to say like, I'm so sorry you're in pain, I used to say, I'm okay, or it's okay.
Same.
I'm no longer saying that anymore, right? I'm like, me too. Or yeah, it's terrible. And kind of being able to say and accept that it's not okay that we suffer with this. And it's not okay that we are forced to be dealing with this in every facet of our lives. So I think it was trying to flip the narrative and also try to raise my voice for others who may not be able to have the platform or be able to share their story in the way that I could.
And there's also a misinterpretation that still exists today, even though there's been a lot of work with awareness and advocacy, that endometriosis is bad cramps.
Yeah.
That, oh, too bad, you have pain during your period.
Right.
And that it's a benign disease.
Right.
It's not. As
No.
we know, it can affect your extrapelvic area, to your lungs, to your kidneys,
Yeah.
the nerve pain that it induces, appendicitis. I mean, there's so many things that it does to cause major upheaval in the entire immune system, the body.
Yeah.
What are some of your pet peeves with just the societal view of endometriosis?
Well, I think the number one thing is just, it speaks to what you just said, right? It's that it's just a pelvic disease. It's just a women's disease. I think about the fact that I've had horrific migraines, horrible headaches, numbness, weird nervous system stuff, gallbladder problems, GI issues, digestive issues, like every possible system in my body has been affected by this in some capacity, right? So throwing out the narrative that endometriosis is a women's disease, I think cuts the root of the problem. I think instantly when there's this notion that something is a women's disease, there's this hysteria associated with it, or this women, no, they're hysterical about it. It's too emotional. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I've been to the ER more times than I can count with drips of morphine and still in incapacitating pain. Like, I'm pretty sure that I'm not being hysterical about this or being overly emotional. So I think, the thought of, again, it just being a women's disease and the fact that, it's something that somehow painkillers is the only way to survive, or you just survive through it every month, or to your point earlier, it's just bad cramps. We know that is, of course, the pelvic pain for me was the number one symptom, no doubt, and continues, that is the reason why I was able to figure out that this is what I had. But it has affected every facet of my body and all different kinds of systems, not just reproductively. So I think that's, the number one thing with endo. And then again, just this notion that women are hysterical and women are overly emotional and they're complaining, for no reason, when we know that absolutely there is a reason.
I had someone say to me, well, you obviously just can't handle pain. And that was such a slap in the face, because it was like, really? Okay, years I've handled 10 plus pain and tried to, as you said, push through it. It got to a point where I was almost in renal failure.
Yeah.
And to have someone say that was like, this was said to me after I had more than one excision surgery, after I was diagnosed, and to have it be, well, you just can't handle pain. That's what so many people have encountered with this disease. And I think that's part of the frustration. It's just that there's this misinterpretation, mislabeling of what it is that kind of needs to be turned upside down in order for people to have the empathy and compassion to finally get what it is to live with it.
Yeah. And I think if people knew, right, that it's not like, listen, I would love to just have bad cramps. I would love for that to be the only symptom, right? I was trying to explain how this cycle has been post this excision surgery. And I'm like, well, I think it's, I'm on, I'm having my first real period since, surgery, because I'm for the first time not on birth control, in my life for now. I'm just taking a little break before I figure out what the next thing is. But it's like, and I'm like, oh, I feel like what I'm having now is like what a typical cramp is. And I'm like, I don't know what a typical menstrual cramp is. The kind of pain that we're in is like absolutely not a typical thing anyway. So I think throwing that notion on its head, and also again to say, I wish that this was just abdominal pain. And I think I've alluded to this before, but how many times I went to the ER because I'm like, I can't even breathe. I'm in so much pain. I'm just sitting here on the floor. Like, I feel like I'm going to die. And then leaving with a discharge paper, like abdominal pain. No, like, absolutely. I would love for this to have just been abdominal pain.
Right. The idea of the comorbidities that endo has and yes, I think that's the confusion. The other thing that you touched upon in your op-ed that I thought hasn't been touched upon enough or really at all publicly, was there's so much onus on the patient to figure it out.
Yeah.
The doctors to say, well, tell us what you want to do. And you're like, well, I didn't go to medical school.
Right.
So why was that so important for you to highlight?
Because I think it's one of those things where I'm sitting here and I'm like, I'm already in agonizing pain. I'm already sitting here hurting so deeply, mentally and physically, right? Like, you have the first, layer of this is the fact that this is a deeply painful illness. And then you have the fact that people aren't necessarily believing you or telling you, oh, it's not as bad as you think, or it could be worse, or it's just this, it's not that big of a deal. Like you said earlier, it's benign. So you have all these kind of already your head filled with ideas of like, maybe it is in my head, and maybe I am wrong, and maybe I'm not considering all the things. So, and then on top of all that, you are feeling it, right? Yeah. And then you have to teach yourself, okay, what actually is this, and what's the misinfo and what's not, and how do and I guess in my nature, right, as a journalist, I am a researcher. I like to know everything. I like to know facts. I want to know details. And so I put it upon myself. I'm like, okay, I need to learn everything I need to know. And I found in that journey, and I know you know this too, that so many of us who suffer this are learning about stuff on Instagram, on Facebook, on social media. And I mean, when you think about how outrageous that is, this affects 1 in 10 people born with uteruses, and probably more, frankly, right? Like, we don't even know how many people because of the limited diagnostics for it. Mm-hmm. And the fact that I'm having to, somebody who is lucky enough and privileged enough to have access to have healthcare, to have all these things, I'm having to teach myself about this. Like, there's something seriously wrong with that. So I wanted to make sure that I highlighted the fact that the onus is on people who are already dealing with a really difficult, debilitating disease, mentally, physically, and in every way. And then to top it all off, having to teach themselves about it and learn about it on their own and find their own community and find other women and people who suffer from this to teach them and ask questions like, was this normal? Did you go through this? What about this? I wanted to make sure people knew that the onus was unfortunately on the sick. And I think once the ultimate thought would be to get more doctors and more providers a fundamental understanding of what this is. And I think the research part of it and the fact that so many doctors don't seem to fully grasp it. And I think so many gynecologists that I've went to over the course of the year since I was 18, right, have been like, okay, well, try this birth control. Okay, skip birth control. Okay, take this hormonal suppressant. And it was clear in those moments that they didn't really know what they were saying, but I'm like, okay, well, you're the doctor, I'm the patient, I know what I'm feeling, but that sounds okay, I guess. And it's, I think the more and more active, the more and more research there is, the more accountability and understanding of this really vicious disease, the better we can get at treating it.
Yes. Yes. Amen to that. And I think we are having a focus on research, and like I say, awareness is key.
Of course.
But now let's turn it into action. And the action is the research and trying to figure out the science of it. Because like you said, it's not just the symptoms. It's not just pelvic pain. There's so many comorbidities and issues and autoimmune things and components that, like, even if you excise, and this is obviously more of a science clinician topic, but even if you excise the lesions, there's so many people, myself included, who still have symptoms that are, I guess you could say, are flaring up.
Sure.
Even to joint pain, it's there's a lot of things going on within the body.
I've had so many random symptoms, like random leg pain, radiating pain, side pain. Sometimes like randomly, like I said, I would get like numbness, and I'm like, this all has to somehow be connected. I'm not entirely sure how, but like but again, to your point of all these comorbidities, right? But that when you stop isolating it as a women's disease and stop isolating it to the pelvic floor, to the pelvic organs, to the reproductive organs, then I think we start to understand and get a better understanding of the complexity of the disease. And I think even when I was first teaching myself about it, the definitions were, it's the tissue that grows in the uterus outside. We know that it's not. It's similar, and that's why, and that's where the distinction is, right? It's extra pelvic. It's not. It's extra uterine. It's not the tissue. It's not the endometrium. It is similar to it. And I think if the definition there's misinformation about, the definition is questioned or unclear, like every other possible treatment or intervention, there's going to be confusion surrounding. So I think, it starts there too. And again, that's something that I've learned in my own personal research, right? Of leading myself there.
What advice do you have to someone who might be watching this and going, okay, I'm at the beginning of my endo journey. I was just diagnosed. How do I look forward and go, there's no cure at this point. There's only a very limited options of therapies and surgery, which is incredibly expensive if insurance doesn't cover it. So what advice do you give to that person who's at that point of their endo journey?
I think it's a couple pieces, right? I think the first thing is going back to what I was saying about this notion of having to power through something and having to tough it out. I think giving yourself permission to say, like, no, this is not okay that this is happening to me. This is really scary. This is awful. And not having to sit there and tell yourself, I'm fine and I'll get through it. And give yourself the permission to rest and know that that doesn't mean that you're weak or that something is wrong with you, to want to just take a step back and rest. And if that's what your body needs, that's what you need. So knowing and reminding yourself constantly that that is there for you and you should take that, I think is a way to flip this and get in front of it in that way. And then having just a supportive community of people that you can share your journey with, even if they don't suffer the same fate, just your family and friends, and letting them know, like, maybe if I'm going to bail on plans, like, it's not you. I'm having a rough one, right? And being able to tell them, like, I'm having a hard day today. I'm having a flare up, and knowing you have a community of people in your life to listen to you and to validate your pain. And then also, I would just say, unfortunately, it takes a while and it can take a long time, but there are empathetic, compassionate, and caring providers out there. Unfortunately, it's probably not going to be the first, maybe even not the second provider you find, but there are some people out there who deeply care about you and about this disease and who understand that it is a really difficult thing to endure. So I would say, don't be discouraged by even the first or second provider you find, and know that there are people out there who have compassion and have respect for your pain and who validate what you've gone through.
What's your hope for the future for the endometriosis community?
Well, I just hope that the awareness continues to be raised. I've been very inspired by the fact that we've seen a lot of celebrities come out and say they've got it. I think that's a huge step in getting awareness. I can't tell you how many people have told me, people who are smart and people who are educated and people who work really hard and people who are in, all across the spectrum, have been like, I feel like an idiot. I never knew anything about this disease until you talked about it. And I'm like, okay, well, that's got to change. But then when you start seeing people out there like Olivia Culpo and Chrissy Teigen and people out there sharing their experience, that again, to a wide audience, and to be able to share that with a large platform, I think that makes a difference. Again, it shouldn't be upon the sick people to be sharing their stories, but I think it helps. And that's part of why I shared mine. So I'm hopeful that the awareness level continues to be risen. And then I also hope, that doctors, whether it's in medical school or beyond, there's a new kind of training or treatment and training for people to understand the complexity of the disease, and for them to be able to be humble enough to know what they don't know about this disease. Because I think a lot of providers feel like they know it all. They're, again, back to, they went to med school, we didn't. However, it has felt for me, and I think for you as well at times, that I'm coming with more understanding of the thing that I'm suffering from. So it's got to start with providers being aware and getting more research and their own studying of the disease, and then continued community awareness and outreach of it too. And then more funding, right, to get research, because there is still such little understanding. We don't even know what causes it. Like we have no idea. There was theories about retrograde menstruation and theories about all these different things, but we have no clue. So how can we treat something?
All of it.
Right. We're still not clear. Like people are like, how'd you get it? I don't know. Is it hereditary? It could be. We don't know. Right. Like I think that on all that awareness will help, and hopefully research and stuff will help us get more answers on that.
I've had people ask me if it was contagious.
Oh, okay.
I'm like, yes, woo.
Yeah, here you go. Like, but again, it's just like, it speaks, and some of it is like, it's not even ignorance, right? Like when people would tell me like, I feel so stupid that I don't know. I'm like, it's not even ignorance, right? It's just like, it's just not out there. And when people are like, wait, you mean more people have this than diabetes? And I've never heard of it. I'm like, yeah, I don't have an answer for why. I mean, it's ridiculous.
There's so many theories, and some being just the pecking order of where anyone born with the uterus falls.
Yeah.
Still in 2021.
No, I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that if men had to feel one menstrual cramp, let alone like a true endo flare up, like I think we would have a magic pill or something, because this kind of suffering is not at all something that anybody should ever feel. And I wouldn't wish it upon anybody, but I do wish that perhaps the people who make these decisions and the people who are part of the research and the people who create drugs could maybe feel it just for a second to understand the urgency and the fact that it's not benign. I think about how many times I did the ER when I couldn't breathe and I was in all this pain, and they're like, well, it wasn't an emergency, so you'll be charged the whole cost. And I'm like, it wasn't an emergency when I couldn't breathe. It wasn't an emergency when my pain was so bad I couldn't even speak. Like again, and that speaks again to research, education, and providers having an awareness and an understanding.
Yeah, and the healthcare system at large too. When you think about when it says it's not an emergency, well, I've heard stories from other women, one being a physician herself who had a bowel obstruction.
Yeah.
And they kept telling her, no, it's okay. Once you get your period, because you have endo, it will go away. And she almost died because they refused to operate on her that night. And that's just the kind of story that you go, it isn't benign. It isn't a benign disease.
And it's not an elective procedure to get something to try to get you to not be suffering in 10 out of 10 pain so many days. Like that's a frustrating part too. But again, that speaks to the bigger issue of the understanding of the disease, right? Like they're sending her home because they don't think that it's an emergency, because they only see it as, okay, it's a menstrual cramp once a month kind of pain, period pain. Like, and that's just, again, if you change the understanding of the fact and you reclassify it as not a women's disease, then I think perhaps that will be less frequent. Those kinds of things will happen less. That is my hope.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you for joining us today, for sharing your story, for offering your insights, and for that very powerful essay.
Of course.
And I hope you'll come back on.
I will. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.